Welcome to the fifth masterclass on Slavoj Žižek's philosophy. In this class, we're going to be focused on the concept of the death drive. For Žižek, the death drive is a fundamental principle. And this fundamental principle is something which is against many other fundamental principles from spirituality or psychology or otherwise, which we'll get into a little bit. But we want to start with the most important dimension is that the death drive is something which is beyond pleasure. The death drive is something where Zizek formulates the space, the psychical topography that Freud starts to approach in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. The beyond of pleasure is a drive for something beyond worldly objects. For the pleasure principle, there is always a worldly object which one wants, whether that's food, whether that's sex, whether that's some other material gain that will bring some basic pleasure. And that this motion for Freud starts to regulate the subject. You regulate yourself in relationship to different worldly objects which bring pleasure, and this solidifies the ego. However, the death drive is beyond all of this, and it is a first step towards, according to Zizek, real subjective freedom and real detachment from the world. So that brings us to the metaphysics of the drive. The metaphysics of the drive is that when you're in the mode of the pleasure principle, your mask, the ego you present to the world, is being solidified by worldly objects, but it's not really you. And there are all sorts of cracks and gaps and antagonisms inside your ego, your imaginary ego, which need to be broken down in order to reach your truth, because the world mask is in some sense preventing you from a more direct confrontation with trauma and with a negativity which needs to be confronted for true self-definition. When one is in the mode of the drive itself, one is no longer aligning oneself to worldly objects of pleasure, but the pure potential of becoming. The pure potential which is not seen in the world, which is invisible in the world, but which is nonetheless the most real thing of our day-to-day, moment-to-moment existence. But the problem is when you drop the world mask and you align yourself with pure potential, what you're really doing is affirming an eternal tension and an eternal struggle. That it's never going to be easy. There's always going to be ups and downs. There's always going to be vicissitudes. And this is the reality of the drive. But this brings joy, which is beyond pleasure. You get a joy in excess of excitement and passion and becoming, because you are no longer tethered to the world mask. This means for Zizek that the principle of thanatos is more fundamental. It's asymmetrically more fundamental than eros. It's not a binary opposition, which is a balance of the opposites. Thanatos opens up the space for eros, which could largely be seen as the drive opens up the space for the pleasure principle, or the unconscious opens up the space, the id opens up the space for the will. So thanatos is underlying the will. The death drive is underlying the will. But the will is not the ultimate reality, is not the ultimate creative principle. And that means that you will never be truly reinventing yourself. You will never be truly creating unless you drop the world mask, which is always going to be creating in relation to something, and you go to the death drive and create in relationship to less than nothing from my previous video. The most important thing is that because thanatos is more fundamental, because the death drive is more fundamental, it is a movement of its own. It's not a movement which we are in control of. We can't stop this movement. It is in some sense the ground upon which we think we're creating. It's the ground upon which we think we're in control. And this brings us to the level of how Zizek understands the concept of the Holy Spirit, to put it in direct conversation with other spiritual traditions. So, in regards to the Buddhist void, you have this idea of the release of all tension and the pure void of subjectivity. For Zizek, this is the maximal expression of the pleasure principle, which seeks to release oneself from all tension. When you feel tension, you go for a pleasure object which will relieve the tension. And for Zizek, the Buddhist void is the logical immanence of the pleasure principle itself. Then, in relationship to Heidegger's central notion that design, the being in the world, what's fundamental is the will core of subjectivity. For Zizek, the death drive is more fundamental, as I said, than the will core of subjectivity. It's more fundamental than our being in the world. It breaks being in the world fundamentally. And so, on that level, Zizek says the drive is the immortal drive, which is a movement all of its own, and what Christianity would refer to as the Holy Spirit, the egalitarian community, the community of love. It's a pure motion of love. So thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.